Hello and welcome to part 2 of my video tutorial series on how to draw a simple cave battle map on GIMP for the purposes of tabletop role-playing games. You can either print and play these maps or you can upload them to a virtual tabletop like Roll20, Fantasy Grounds, or Foundry VTT. If you haven't watched part 1 of this series, I suggest you do it. There'll be a link in the description below. It gets you from having nothing to this map that you see here so far. It doesn't sound like a lot, but I do a lot of explaining of my processes kind of on the back end and setting the image up so that things down the road go smoother. It also, we set up the maps so that it uploads really well to virtual tabletop, specifically Roll20, but others will work fine too. So be sure to check it out. But if you don't have time, you can certainly dive in from this one, no problem. So in this video, we're going to be adding some basic colors. We're going to do a bit of shading and a bit of texturing, and I'll show you the tricks that I use to do so. So the first thing we're going to do, like I said, we're going to add a bit of color to both this section here. That's going to be what we call the floors, all through here, right? And then we're going to be adding a different color to the outside, what I'm going to be calling walls. To do that, we're going to add 2 new layers. We're going to tuck them underneath the lines layer. So you go Control-Shift-N to create new layer. I'm going to name it base. So with all my base color layers, I start the layer name with base dash, and then whatever the feature is that it's a base color for. So floor, Control-Shift-N, base, walls. Okay, so first thing we do is we pick a color. I've saved this light brown color for the floor, and we can choose a darker brown for the walls for now. These colors you can alter later. The only important thing is to just grab a different color for both the walls and the floor so that you can mentally differentiate the two while you're working. Now if you take the bucket fill tool, and if you have your floor layer selected, if you paint right now, it's just going to paint the entire canvas because you're working in a layer that was previously empty, and your bucket fill tool is just going to fill everything it can until it runs into any sort of boundaries, and this canvas on that layer has 0 boundary. So what we need to do in order to accomplish that, we need to go to the lines layer and we make a selection within the lines layer. And that's another big reason why I separate my lines layers from other layers, is that not only is it easier to make edits to a line layer when it's by itself, it also serves a very critical functional purpose for me in that when I make fuzzy select tools, I use my line work as boundaries for these selections. So whenever I need to mess with or make changes to just the floor, I can always go back to this lines layer and make a fuzzy selection just like I did just now, and it's going to immediately grab the entire floor. The fuzzy select tool, I believe it's called Magic Wand in Photoshop, and it's probably got different names in other programs as well, but they all do the same thing. They just basically make a selection whatever color or whatever color that you just selected with your fuzzy select tool, it's going to expand that selection outwards until it runs into boundaries. So it's going to run into all my line work, which is what we want. But if you zoom in, you'll notice it didn't actually grab every single pixel right up until the black. It's missing these transitional pixels that are different shades of gray. So in order to make that selection include halfway through this line or so, we need to actually go to select and grow, and what it's going to do is going to grow the selection by a designated number of pixels. You can choose inches and millimeters and stuff like that. I prefer to just always work in pixels, and then that way you always keep the same unit of measurement. You're never going to get confused. I'm going to grow my selection by 4 pixels. If you'll remember from part 1, the brush strokes that I used for the walls was 10. So we know that it's about 10 pixels from here to here. So we know if we grow the selection by 4 pixels, it's going to land us somewhere in the middle here. So we hit OK. Sure enough, puts our selection halfway through the line, just under halfway through, but enough to completely encompass this entire transition strip here. Okay, so enough about selections. We've got that entire floor area selected. So when we zoom back out, we can flip to our base layer for the floor. We can go back to our bucket fill tool, and now when we hit the bucket fill tool in here, it's going to just fill in the selection. And you'll see here that the affected area will be the whole selection. So go ahead and click. There you go. The entire floor layer is colored now. Now we can create a new selection for the outer region by navigating back to our lines layer and then clicking outside, and then we'd still have to, again, you'll still have to grow the selection by a certain number of pixels by going to select grow. Instead of doing that, I'll save you a couple steps. So we're going to back ourselves up to, we've just finished painting the floor layer and we've still got our selection active. If you just go to select and invert, it's going to flip their current selection on its head. So it's basically going to select everything that isn't the floor, which in this circumstance is the entirety of the walls layer, which is exactly what we're looking for. So now I switch to the base layer for the walls. I flip my colors, the foreground and background colors, to make my active color, or my foreground color, the darker shade of brown. And I'm just going to click the bucket tool on the outside. And there we are. We've got both colors painted. It's looking decent already, but it could use a lot of work still. You could certainly use this map and just go from there, but I like to do a bit more before I'm ready to call it even close to done. So the next thing you'll notice is the grid disappeared, and that's because we've got two layers that are strictly flat colors sitting on top of this grid layer, so it's now hidden. What I like to do, you can drag it up here, and now you've got your grid layer back. But one step better, in my opinion, is actually sandwiching it in between the walls layer and the floor layer. That is one of the key reasons why I have two separate layers for these base colors. When I sandwich it in between, the grid is only going to show up on the walkable portions of the map. 99% of the time that you're going to be running a session with this map, you're not going to need to know what the grid squares are doing up in this area or up here or anything like that. There is the odd time that players will do something crazy and try and blast through a wall or something like that. But in those really rare circumstances, you can definitely wing it. For all the other circumstances, you'll be happy that the grid isn't sitting up in this area and frankly looking a little bit displeasing to the eye. So that's why I do that. Getting back to the next step, we're going to add a bit of texture to the floor layer. It doesn't take a genius to figure out that when you walk into any cave, even in real life, and you look straight down, you're not going to look at this uniform sheet of beige or whatever color. There's going to be lots of lighting differences, lots of different shades and tones. It's not going to be looking as uniform as it is right now. So we're going to do something that will emulate some of the randomness of nature and the organic kind of quality of that. What we're going to do is, instead of interacting directly with the base layer, we're going to create a new layer on top. We're going to call it texture dash floor. So this is another category of layers that I do a lot of work with, is texture layers. We're going to, right off the hop, we're going to change the type of the layer, or the mode, to overlay instead of normal. What that's going to do is, now whenever we paint on this layer, depending on the darkness, the lightness, or the hue values of the colors that we're selecting and painting with, it's going to affect all of the layers below it. All the layers below it in this case would be this base layer for the floor and actually the white background. That white background's not really going to appear anymore for the rest of this map, but it's good to keep it just in case you need to do any line work and you don't want to focus on the colors. You could easily just go back and do some line work with just black and white. It might be easier for you to do work that way. So it's good to keep it. And even the layout layer, like, you could delete it if you want. I don't like to delete things until I know for sure I don't want them anymore. So I just make it invisible for now. But that was a bit of a tangent. We'll get back to this texture layer. So we've created this new layer on top of the layer that we want to affect. We've changed the layer style, or the layer mode, to overlay. What we're going to do is we're going to choose a brush. We're going to click this to set our default foreground and background back to black and white. I've chosen this brush here. It comes with the basic GIMP install. The brush is called Texture Hose 03. I don't know why it's called that, but it is one of my favorite brushes on GIMP to use for texturing. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually crank the size of that up to like an obnoxious level, like 700 pixels. It seems like that's way too big a brush to be doing any painting on this map, but you'll see what it'll do in the next few seconds here. So I'm going to turn the opacity down to about 15%. Now all I'm going to do is, rather than clicking and dragging and painting long strokes, I'm just going to click and stamp. Click and stamp. And it's okay if you overlap, because there's going to be darker tones here and there. And there's going to be some spots that hardly got any overlap or even any attention with the brush, and that's okay too, because the whole purpose of this is to add an element of randomness to the floor layer to make it look more like it's actually a dirt or a stone floor rather than just painted concrete. So you can see already, it's taken me 15 seconds to do this up, and I've put basically no thought into doing this other than just trying to get kind of an even coverage. It already makes the colors look a bit better. And one thing you can do too is if you're getting to a point where you think it's too dark, instead of painting on your overlay layer with black, you can switch to white. And with white, you got to make sure you turn the opacity down further, because for some reason white on overlays has a greater effect than black does. So I always tend to go to the single digits, and then you can start painting some white stamps on top as well to give it even further element of randomness. There you are. So it looks a bit more, sandy. Sandy soil or rocky soil. It looks certainly better. Here, I'll toggle this on and off so you can tell the impact that it has. So as you can see, in my mind anyways, it looks better. And it's something that I do for pretty much every map I've made. I add some texture like that. Another thing I'm going to do now is, along with that texture layer, I'm going to create another overlay layer. I'm going to call it shading, and the shading is going to be from the walls. So the idea behind that is I'm creating another layer that is going to create a shadow effect on the floor, but it's going to be because of the walls. So that's why I add that name from walls rather than saying shading floor. I've called it from walls. I just know when I'm dealing with maps down the road that have like 50 or so layers, it's good for me to know that the shading has like what the source of those shadows is, not the surface that the shadow is touching, but the source of it. But I mean, the naming of the layers is really, it's semantics, so you can do whatever you want. This is the way I do it. So anyways, getting back to it, so I've created the layer. We need to switch that one to overlay as well. We're going to choose a black brush. We're going to turn the size right down to about 100. The opacity can go back up to about 15. Maybe closer to 11 or 12. Now what we're going to do is we're going to paint along the edges of these walls, and because the opacity is turned down, one brush stroke won't look like it has much of an effect. But once you layer them on top of each other in certain places, you'll see the cumulative effect of that. So again, we're dealing with an overlay layer, so although we're painting on this layer, it's going to look like it's changing this layer, and it is in fact changing it. It's just not permanently changing it. That's the whole purpose of having these multiple layers, is that you're doing what are called non-destructive edits. So anyways, we're going to start painting here yet again in this overlay layer, and you'll see one brush stroke, it darkens it a bit, and that may be all you want, but for me, there's certain corners, and closer to the wall, I like to make it darker the closer you get to the wall, right? So I'm just adding more and more brush strokes, and they just stack on top of each other and get darker and darker. And so you can do your first big brush stroke to just kind of get it nice and dark, kind of working your way out from the wall, and then as you get closer to the wall, you add more and more brush strokes, and they just kind of stack on top of each other, right? And once you zoom out, that's going to look like you're not going to see any hard lines or anything like that. It's going to look fairly natural looking. And you can see already that the effect that it's having, it's giving a bit of height to that wall, right? So I'm just going to go along. I'm going to speed up the video in a minute because you don't need to watch me doing this the whole way. But I'm not paying a huge amount of attention to what I'm doing. You can get a bit sloppy because the randomness element is what we're going for, right? So, there's not really any straight lines that exist in nature or hard angles. So, the less we get towards that, and the more we avoid it, the better. Doing this shading work here that I'm about to do, it takes a few minutes to get the entire map done. It's a great opportunity to, if you're like me, I can't listen to much music or watch a TV show while I'm doing this. It requires too much concentration. I end up, whatever I'm watching, I don't really, it doesn't sink in. So, but doing work like this doesn't take much mental power, so it's a great opportunity to turn on your favorite D&D podcast or listen to some music or whatever. So, yeah. Okay, so I went ahead and did all the shading and all the shadows from the walls. And you can just, doing some touch-ups here while we talk, but you can see, what an impact it's had, how much height it is added to those walls and given it real definition. And it's something simple that took me a total of, less than 5 minutes to hammer that out, and it's had a pretty good impact. You'll notice if you're paying attention there, I shaded this room itself a few times over like that, just because I've decided that room itself is going to be a bit darker than the rest of them. So yeah, there you have it. There's, you got texture for the floors, you've got shadows as a result of the walls. When you're done doing that, shading all the walls, adding shadows to it, if you find that there's certain areas that are too dark, rather than going back in and erasing, like that, and starting over, especially once you have like the eraser tool when it's at 100% opacity is really blunt. Instead of doing all that, you can actually take your entire shadow overlay layer. You can turn the opacity of the layer itself down. So if you didn't want those shadows to be as outrageous or as noticeable, you can turn that right down so that it's only just slight around the edges. But I'm fine with the way that looks. Maybe knock it down a few percentage points, but that's good. The only other thing I'm going to do, I'm going to add a bit of highlighting to the walls to further add height. So instead of adding shadow, I'm going to add highlights. The setup is the same. I'm just going to create another overlay layer on top. We're going to call it shading wall highlights. Again, the names of the layers isn't important. You can always change them down the road. That's just what I call it. Again, change your mode to overlay. And I'm going to swap to white. I'm going to take my brush tool. My opacity, I'm going to want no higher than about 5. And brush size of 107, that's good. And all I'm going to do is just kind of go along here. Add a bit of white around there, highlights. You know what, actually I'm going to undo all that. I don't think that opacity needs to be down a bit more. And I'm going to bump up the height or size of that brush. There we go. More incremental. Again, you'll notice, with the white, when you're dealing overlays, the effects of the white is so much more sudden that the opacity. I almost never work with double-digit opacity with white when I'm doing overlays. But again, as you can see right off the hop, it's adding a bit of height to those walls. There is something that's problematic in here, and you'll notice right off the hop. I'm trying to affect the wall layer up here, but because I'm dancing along these lines, my brush strokes are actually bleeding off and affecting the floor below it, so it's actually highlighting it a bit, and that's not what we're going for. So the way that we mitigate that is if we tuck the wall layer and the associated overlay layer into their own layer group, you can see down here, create new layer group. It's basically a folder. If you tuck them all into their own individual folder, what happens is that overlay layer is now only ever going to affect the layers below it that are in the same folder. So now you can see right off the hop that highlighting that was hitting the floor is no longer there, but it's still on the walls. To show you the difference again, I'll pull it back out of that group. So layer management and putting all the layers in a logical order is crucial to making this map look good, and not having things happen that you don't otherwise want to, like for example highlighting the previously shaded areas. So again, I'm just going to go along here. I'm just going to kind of do this quick and dirty. Again, you don't have to spend a terrible amount of attention or focus on doing something like this, because the more random and the more messy it looks, the more aesthetically pleasing and natural it's going to look, especially when you're dealing with something like a cave system, right? Okay, so I'm going to back off here so you can see the entire map now, and when I toggle that layer on and off, again, you go from boring plain brown to something that has a bit of shade, a bit of tone to it, and it further accentuates the height difference between the walls and the floor below. Now, I had already pre-selected these two colors, the light brown and the dark brown, so the map doesn't look too bad with the colors that we've chosen. But if you ever wanted to change them, it's super simple. So all you would do is you click. Let's say we weren't happy with this brown layer that the walls are painted as. You select that layer, and rather than trying to grab your bucket tool and selecting a new color, instead of doing that, just go to Colors, and again, make sure you have that selected. Go to Colors, Colorize. It defaults to this teal color every time you go to the colorize prompt, but let's say you wanted something that was like a very pale green or something like that. That doesn't look half bad. It looks kind of cool. But the cool thing about the colorize tool is you can just pick all these colors. You haven't changed anything yet because you haven't hit OK, but you can play with the colors and see how they look compared to the brown. We could go with something that's mostly gray instead, to signify rocks. There, that doesn't look half bad either. Let's try that. So we've chosen it. You can play with the hue, the saturation, and the lightness as well. I'll leave that up to you to experiment with. But you hit OK. There, you've changed the color of it. Same thing with the floor. Let's say you want the floor to have a, maybe the dirt is more towards the red shade. That looks kind of cool too. Maybe it's purple. Again, like the colorize tool, like you just select anything under the sun, and the great thing about it is it's going to retain all of the shading, all of the texturing, because you've got everything packed up on different layers. So we'll go back to, I'm sure, shade like that. Okay, so that's going to do it for this tutorial. I believe the next tutorial I'm going to add a bit more texture to the outer walls. I'm going to add some smaller details, like maybe some rubble and rocks and stones kind of along the perimeters of the walls. On the list is adding a water feature and maybe some props like crates or barrels, but that'll be the subject of later parts in this series. So thanks for tuning in, and happy mapping.